are just regular occurrences in basically every opening. But I don't see any justification for weakening the b4 square like that. It's quite clear that Gukesh is flat out better out of the opening here, given his control over the b4 square. The idea of playing a3 and b4 is a very important component of White's plan in these lines. So
Yep.
without it, Danny, Black is holding all of the cards here in the early going.
Yeah, I agree totally. So we'll see if that throwback or callback to what happened in that MVL matchup, the only Speed Chess Championship match that Magnus Carlsen has ever lost, for those who didn't get that memo. Okay, but it's early. White is a little worse, but still, you're going to get castled. There's going to be a lot of chess ahead in this game. I think I always draw my attention to the clock, Danya, and just see that Gukesh is keeping pace at this point with the world champion. That's always a good sign when you're looking at the timer.
And Magnus, without question, over the last couple of years, has gotten a lot faster. He is not an easy guy to face in time scrambles. He might
Yeah.
not be as fast as Hikaru. Obviously, nobody is in time scrambles, but it's not like if Gukesh manages to get this down to 30 seconds for both players, he's necessarily going to stand to benefit. I actually don't think Magnus minds a bunch of these
Yeah.
time scrambles, given Gukesh's relative lack of experience online. But yeah, you can see Magnus in kind of defense mode, going bishop a6. He wants to trade the bishops off. I think he's even happy to get away with a draw in game one here.
Yeah, he's getting rid of a potentially dangerous bishop on that long diagonal, kind of typical of these positions. It's sort of transposed from what was a Nimzo move order for those who might be just tuning in. Where have you been? Magnus is playing. Morpheus is fighting Neo. Let's go. But now it's a position that is a little bit tamer. It looks kind of like a Queen's Gambit declined or exchange kind of theory that we might have had here.
Yeah, and good squares don't win games. Just because Black holds the b4 square doesn't really mean that White's position collapses. Gukesh trying to make the most of his opportunity. The knight jumping into d3, but I think
Yeah.
Magnus doesn't need to overreact. Just rook a to b1, and then you can kind of nibble around the edges. You could play h3, make some lufts. Bishop e1 is a nice move, kind of forcing the trade. And Danny, if Magnus manages to untangle a little bit further here, he might start playing for the advantage. I mean, you have that c6 square. The idea of knight back to d4 could be unpleasant. The other knight, Catalan style, can jump into d3. I've seen Magnus win these kinds of games so many times. I mean, haven't we all?
Yeah. More times than any of his opponents would like to admit. I agree. We're back to a roughly 50-50 position. And again, it is a tame one, so we're not saying Gukesh is worse yet. But I like your idea of knight d4, knight c6, knight d3. And the problem here is, what exactly is Black's plan to prevent White from improving, right? Even though that computer says Black has a microscopic edge. Yeah, if I'm Gukesh, I'm like, what?
Yeah.
I might even just simplify this and not let Magnus think he's going to play for a win.
There's just so many decisions you make just on the basis of one observation alone, and that's who you're playing. I think bishop takes c1 is a move Gukesh probably wouldn't play against most other grandmasters, but I think it is a very good practical decision against Carlsen as he activates his own knight. We might see knight b5 to d4. We might see rook a to c1. But at this point, I think Magnus is breathing a lot easier than he was after a4.
Yeah, I can't wait to discuss. Obviously, we'll see who wins. We usually have an interview after a match, and just ask Magnus early if he did indeed mouse slip that. Shout out to Tactics and Swindles. Great name. All right, here
That's
we've
all
got
I
a
do.
Tactics and Swindles. That's all I used to do. But not anymore. All right, man. Well, this looks like a pretty tame position. If White gets b4 though, and then b5. And then c6 is an anchor outpost square, and then a7 is weak. Come on, Danya, give me some highlights. There you go, baby. I love that.
There you go. Christmas colors there. I wanted red, though. Oh, there we go. Red is the basic color. b4 by Magnus, and the Magnus Whisper strikes again. And the clock situation, Danny, he's up a nice solid 40 seconds. And again, I can't emphasize this enough. Gukesh is just not an experienced online player, so it's just so easy to panic when you get, especially below a minute. I think that's the threshold when relatively inexperienced players sometimes start to panic online.
Yep. I agree. And you can already see the eval bar is an evil bar if you're Gukesh, because here comes an edge for White. And as highlighted, if b5 occurs and the knight pops on c6, even if objectively Black should still be okay, from a practical perspective, when you add time onto the clock, he's now down by 30 seconds.
Yeah.
Here comes Magnus.
And let's not forget about the move f3. That's a very nasty move here because the knight doesn't have any good squares. If it drops back to d6, that enables the move knight c6. And there's all sorts of tactics there with knight e7 check. I attempt number 4. Okay, there we go. And Danny, if the knight moves back to g5, you could toss it back even further with h4. I think Magnus is deciding right now between f3 or b5,
Yep.
and f3 is on the board.
You called it. F3 going to kick the knight back to d6 before maybe knight c6 happens immediately. So Gukesh is going to trade. Yeah, at this point, it's not necessarily panic mode, but it is Houston. We have a problem. Let's simplify this thing before bad things happen.
Yeah, and it's already amazing as early as game one how Magnus has transformed just a clearly worse position out of the opening, and not an unbalanced worse position, a worse position with a symmetrical pawn structure. And now you would never guess that he mouse slipped with a4 on like move 5. Like you would never be able to tell.
Yeah. That's
I mean,
why
the
I
pawn's
can't wait
still
to.
on
I mean, I
a4.
know I'm with you that it was a mouse slip, but I'm like, I have this weird, I suffer from Magnus bias-itis. I never really know.
No, totally.
By the way,
totally.
Queen d2 threatens, or it did maybe threaten knight takes a7 because the rook would have been overworked on d7, but Queen g5 hits e3, so Magnus has to defend that pawn.
Yeah, and you normally don't want to play f4 here and weaken the e4 square. You definitely don't want to give too many prospects to Black's knight.
Yep.
But, I mean, Magnus might decide on something a little bit more drastic given Gukesh's time situation. You could also see a move like rook to c3. If Gukesh can get the rooks off the board, I think he would love to do that. Given the fact that White's got these weaknesses.
I think we got to show the line you're showing if we want to bring up the analysis board. We have to show this sacrifice coming from Gukesh. 94 potentially with queen takes e3 check. I think we got to show that. 94 queen takes rook c3 wasn't played. Rook c2 was played.
Oh, rook c2 was played, but I think this illustrates the general idea, which is that White can go hunting for the queenside pawns, but e3 is always going to be a problem. But Danny, I think the idea of rook c2 is an antidote to 94. If you play it now, this looks very imposing, but after king f1, there are simply no checks. The rook's defending f2. Very important.
Yeah, so rook c2 does stop not just queen f2 mate, but if the king had gone to h1, the infamous Venus flytrap mating pattern. So that's what I wanted to show, was that Gukesh had an awkward threat there. But okay, it doesn't happen. Magnus plays rook c2. We see in the live position, Gukesh has offered a queen trade.
No, that's the worst thing to do against Magnus. You've got a worse endgame in game one. And again, look at the time. You've got 30 seconds to defend it. I don't know about this.
I'm with you. And I draw attention to the time control for those just tuning in. We got a long format ahead here. 90 minutes of 5-minute has just begun. We are only in the first game, but Gukesh under 20 seconds starts to become its own enemy, the clock. You got two enemies now, the world champion and the clock.
And the third is the fact that you're a pawn down at a rook endgame against the world champion. I think Magnus would be playing for a win with Black here. I mean, when you're the one down a pawn, Magnus is just going to kind of push his kingside pawns, maybe f5. There goes the second pawn. Oh, Gukesh is losing this. No way.
Objectively, yeah, it's hard to be in a lost rook ending against Magnus. But okay, Gukesh, he will get white right next game, and that'll be interesting to see what the youngster brought to the table in regards to preparation, because players don't hold back in this format.
Right.
There's a lot at stake, and you see theory happen on deep levels in the SEC. I'm not saying this game's over yet, but I'm saying this game's over.
I think
I'm not saying it's over, but I'm saying
you're kind of saying it's over. Of course, Magnus, he screws these up about one time out of every 100. And he's got plenty of time. Great time management in the endgame. Now it's over. Yeah. Now he's just going after all the pawns. No, 2 seconds for Gukesh, and he's simply going to resign. What a game by Magnus. That's just like a classic, old school, grinded out world champion game right there.
Yep. Magnus, of course, will now take on the black pieces as they rematch. But no, that was why Magnus is Magnus, right? We expect this to be a tough one, an uphill battle, where inevitably in the end we will all be rooting for Gukesh if we want to see him keep it close. But right now, you're right. That was vintage Magnus, despite the